since the initial report was published, and obviously the government's response to that has only come very recently. So what action has there been to date in response to their findings?
So, obviously we're working very closely, and I know that you've been talking at some length with people from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, but we've been working very closely with them on working through the different recommendations that we've accepted, which obviously is the overwhelming majority of them, and with other organisations that have a role in this, chiefly perhaps ACAS, but also the Health and Safety executive. So specifically with ACAS and the Commission, if I can call it that, they have been working on developing an e-learning training package which is aimed at line managers and staff so that they better understand the rights and responsibilities of all employees, but particularly women who are pregnant and either going on or about to come back from maternity leave. And that will be published on the ACAS website later in the summer, which will be a free resource. There are a number of other equality packages that ACAS has, and they get quite a lot of coverage. I think it's about 5 million hits a year. So we expect this to have significant reach, though of course I do accept that in a sense you have to know that you want to get it right to download one of these things, and the culture change is probably a deeper task. That is why, therefore, we're also working with the Commission and others to see if we can, what are the things that are actually going to prompt employers to do the right thing. And the famous concept of nudge, and you'll be aware of the behavioural insight team. And while it's very early days, we are looking and talking to the Commission about what are the kinds of things that might prompt more engagement by those employers who perhaps are just ignorant of what is a progressive approach to managing these issues, rather than who are sort of willfully trying to ignore them or evade their responsibilities. These are at an early stage, but I wouldn't rule out doing some further work, even conceivably with the unit, to try and understand what sorts of sophisticated techniques might just prompt more engagement by employers. And then finally, perhaps of the things that are particularly worth pulling out in terms of action, it's talking also to the Commission and other business groups, to see what we could do to identify and share best practice, and try and highlight best practice. So as sort of looking at different ways, different options to showcase those employers who do a good job. And I think critically is to try and showcase not just the employers who are doing a good job, but also how they benefit from being the kind of work environment where this approach is taken, and how it actually assists them. Entirely unrelatedly and coincidentally, I attended a dinner organised by Facebook yesterday evening, which was talking about women in enterprise and how one can promote more confidence among women to set up their own business. And it did just occur to me as we had this fascinating discussion with a bunch of female entrepreneurs and various others, that actually the role of organisations like Facebook, similarly on these sorts of issues, in getting out there messages to employers but also to employees, is probably might well be more powerful, and for all of the best efforts, whatever ACAS can do or the Commission can do, because ultimately they have an interaction in people's lives that is deeper and with more people than any government agency.
Thank you. I mean, based on the statistics that have been examined, that have been explained from the EHRC report, 3/4 of pregnant women at some point have ended up facing discrimination. And these are startlingly disgusting figures, actually, in the 21st century. One of the issues, and the first item on the agenda of the report from the HRC, was over leadership. Now, you were here a couple of weeks ago talking about the leaderships that's been taken in relation to tackling discrimination against Muslims in the workplace. Now, compare and contrast, very startling levels of figures in that area and awful figures here, but there doesn't seem to be that sort of sense of leadership. Now, you've obviously explained a couple of low-hanging fruit examples where you're putting in plans of action here, but specifically on leadership, which comes up time and time again. It just came up from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Now, I appreciate the fact you haven't seen that evidence yet. What specifically are you doing in order to, or what is the government doing in order to deliver proper leadership on tackling this issue?
Well, I mean, I think, we considered very carefully the research that was commissioned, and that's one of the reasons why it took a bit longer to publish the government response than we had hoped, because we wanted to take that very seriously and, to try and be as positive as we could be about the Commission's recommendations. So we certainly take it very, very seriously. I do think it's important not to necessarily think that appointing somebody new or inventing a new body is, I'm not saying you were necessarily suggesting that, but that is the only way that government can show leadership. So the Women's Business Council already exists. Ruby McGregor-Smith, who provides a fantastic and leadership of it and has huge credibility in doing so. She's already undertaking a review, as you all know, FORBIS, on other issues that interest to this committee on progression of black and minority ethnic people within employment. But she's been chairing that council. They've reached an audience of 8 million people through active engagement. They've published over 150 topical case studies. So I think it's sort of working with organisations like that that is best going to provide that leadership, rather than necessarily inventing a new body. And the Commission itself does great work. ACAS, frankly, actually does great work. These are all institutions that are well understood by employers. So it's about working with them to put greater emphasis on this. What I would just say is that I share your view that it was truly, and I think I said in the chamber of the House when this was raised at questions, it was a truly depressing picture that was painted in terms of the experience of many women at work. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, but I don't think we necessarily need new institutions or sort of dramatic gestures. We actually need that sort of painstaking, consistent, sustained, month, year, decade-long change of a culture. Because ultimately, in other areas of equalities, we've seen that culture does change, can be changed, and government does have to lead, but it's not usually through sort of flashy announcements. It's through sort of painstaking, steady application.
But you must be aware in this instance, and there have been a multitude of reports that have come out of the EHRC, government has ended up providing a response that have been welcomed by, in some instances universally by the sector, in some instances by the majority of the sector. And the response to this particular government's response to the Equality and Human Rights Commission's report here has almost been universally, it's weak. It's weak in areas which you wouldn't expect them to be weak as well. I mean, one of the areas which I would like to point out, and you focus your attention on the e-learning software, and in relation to the work the dinner you talked about in relation to Facebook, one of the low-hanging fruit issues here would be about creating a website. It wasn't absolutely, yes, we agree upon this. It was, we agree upon this in principle, but not fully embrace it. But ultimately, the response has been almost universally seen as weak. I mean, are there areas which now, listening to the response from the sector, you're thinking, right, okay, we're going to go back and revise this, we're going to think about changing it?
I mean, I just don't accept that. Firstly, the response was not weak. Secondly, I do not accept that it's been universally reviewed as weak. Thirdly, I do not think that there's a sector. Just this old idea that there's somehow a sector, and the sector opinion is what determines whether a government is dealing with something. And fourthly, it is a literally absurd idea that the answer to every problem is to have a new website, which then by definition has a URL which literally nobody knows. And you then have to market that new website, rather than dealing with ACAS, which everybody already knows. It's an institution with a huge history. It's got an enormous depth of material. You want to point people to the resources in places they already go. This is why I mentioned Facebook, because people already go on Facebook. They already go to ACAS. They already go to the Commission's website, because these are bodies that have built up a expertise and a depth of credibility, and they've become destinations both for employers and for people who are facing problems at work. So I just warn against those who suggest that somehow a new website is the answer to all problems. It is, in my view, a slightly glib suggestion, and glibness is not what government should be in the business of.
Look, I personally am not suggesting a new website, but I can absolutely categorically tell you that there has been almost nobody that's given evidence thus far to say that, oh yes, I would approach ACAS in the first instance. Is ACAS working with Facebook, for example?
I don't know, and I'm happy to ask. I only had dinner with Facebook last night, so I'm very happy to find out. But what I can tell you is that ACAS is dealing through the new conciliation procedure with the great majority of all of the cases of maternity-related discrimination that are actually reported by working people. So, of course, they have greater expertise than almost any other institution on this, and it's through them that we will make change. Not through responding to whatever the latest lobby group has decided is the idea of the moment for their latest press release.
Okay, I mean, just to be fair, this isn't just one lobby group. This is pretty much everyone that has come before us thus far. It's not just a small segment. This isn't one person that's come in from a charity that has a vested interest in this particular issue. This is everyone. That should ring alarm bells in my mind.
Well, I'm sorry, I disagree.
Sure.
Minister, we obviously